me-down cardigans. She took it to scholarship meetings and parent nights where she sat alone beside teachers. She took it to every holiday concert and every father-daughter dance she quietly skipped. Other children noticed, the way children always do. They asked careless questions. They said cruel things. They made her background into a story they could gossip over. Marielle never fought them. She simply went silent, opened a book, and retreated into the one place no one could reach her. When she turned 17, Miss Eliza gave her a velvet box no bigger than a palm. Inside was a ring unlike anything else in their small house. It was old, heavy, made of gold so soft it looked almost warm. Set into it was a deep green stone bordered by tiny diamonds, worn smooth in places by age. Inside the band was engraved a crest Marielle didn't recognize. She looked up in confusion, but Miss Eliza only closed Marielle's fingers over the ring and said, "One day, this will answer questions better than I can." Marielle kept it in a drawer wrapped in a handkerchief. She wore it sometimes on a chain beneath her shirt, more out of sentiment than understanding. It was the last meaningful gift Miss Eliza ever gave her. Miss Eliza died 2 years later in her sleep, one hand still resting over the blanket as though she had simply paused in the middle of a dream. She left Marielle the house, a stack of recipe cards held together with a rubber band, a Bible worn soft at the edges, and a sealed envelope tucked inside a metal tin above the pantry. On the front was the name of a law firm embossed in navy lettering. Harrow, Pike and Wren, Charleston. Marielle found it the night after the funeral. The house was too quiet. Every chair looked occupied by memory. She sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of her and her thumb beneath the flap. She nearly opened it, but grief made even curiosity feel heavy. Another truth, another revelation, another unknown thing waiting inside paper felt like more than she could survive that night. So she slid the envelope back into the tin, closed the cabinet door, and left for Atlanta 3 weeks later with a suitcase, a scholarship award, and a ring she did not understand. Atlanta was louder than anything Marielle had known. She worked at a bakery before sunrise, attended classes during the day, and spent evenings filing invoices at a logistics company to cover rent. She earned a degree in accounting because it promised stability, not passion. She learned how to stretch one paycheck across 2 weeks. She learned which grocery stores mark produce down after 9. She learned that loneliness in a city feels different than loneliness in the country. In the country, loneliness is quiet and wide. In a city, it stands shoulder to shoulder with millions of people and still leaves you untouched. Marielle built a life from routine. She paid her bills. She kept her circle small. She never opened the envelope. She never told anyone about the ring. She met Adrian Sloan at a gallery fundraiser. She only attended because her supervisor had a last-minute conflict and gave her the ticket. Adrian walked into every room as if someone had turned the light up a little just for him. He was polished, broad-shouldered, funny when he wanted to be, and carried the relaxed arrogance of a man who had always been welcomed wherever he went. His family operated luxury auto dealerships, commercial partnerships, and several charitable boards across Atlanta. They weren't old Southern money, but they were visible money, the kind people wrote about in local magazines with glossy covers and smiling photos. Adrian noticed Marielle because she did not orbit him the way others did. She was standing near the back, studying a painting no one else seemed interested in. And when he approached with a rehearsed line about art being more interesting than the people at the event, she answered, "Then why are you talking to me instead of looking at the painting?"
Richard Coleman.
He laughed. That laugh became a beginning. He pursued her with persistence that felt flattering to someone who had always been overlooked. Flowers arrived at her office. He sent coffee to her desk on long Fridays. He remembered details she had only mentioned once. Her favorite tea, the bakery she loved, the fact that she hated driving in heavy rain. He took her to restaurants where the napkins were cloth and the menus had no prices printed beside the specials. He opened doors, called when he said he would, and looked at her like stillness itself fascinated him. To a woman who had spent most of her life invisible, being chosen with that much intensity felt like a form of rescue. Marielle told him things she had never told anyone. She told him about Miss Eliza and the farmhouse and how quiet grief becomes when it settles in for years. She told him how, as a child, she used to set 2 plates at dinner even when she ate alone because it made the table feel less abandoned. She told him she sometimes feared she had been made too soft for the world she was living in. Adrian listened with deep, attentive eyes and squeezed her hand at exactly the right moments. What Marielle did not know was that he collected her tenderness the way some people collect leverage. They dated for almost 3 years. He proposed on a rooftop terrace lit with strings of white bulbs and a violinist playing under the skyline. The ring he offered her was elegant and expensive, more expensive than anything Marielle had ever touched with confidence. She cried when she said yes. He kissed her forehead. The photographer stepped from behind a hedge. Somewhere below them, the city glittered like spilled diamonds. When Adrian's mother, Evangeline, first heard the news, she smiled tightly and said all the correct things. But later that night, after the engagement dinner, she told one of her closest friends she is manageable. That matters more than pedigree. Marielle never heard those words. If she had, perhaps the next year would have looked different. The wedding planning was mostly handled by Evangeline. She framed this as generosity. Marielle, working full-time and still watching every dollar, was grateful at first. Evangeline chose the church, the flowers, the choir, the reception menu, even the guest list. When Marielle tried to suggest simpler options, Evangeline laughed and said, "Darling, the Sloanes do not do simple." Adrian rarely pushed back. He seemed content to let his mother direct the spectacle. At the time, Marielle mistook that passivity for trust. She did not yet understand how often cruelty hides inside silence. She noticed, of course, that Evangeline was never warm. She noticed the sharpened compliments. The way the older woman would say, "You were elegance surprisingly well," or "No one would guess where you came from." But Marielle had spent a lifetime enduring discomfort without naming it. She kept smoothing the edges, telling herself families were complicated, weddings were stressful, and love required patience. After the altar, she went back to the apartment she had shared with Adrian for 9 months and sat at the edge of the bed in her wedding gown, still waiting for reality to reveal itself as a misunderstanding. She waited for him to burst through the door and say his mother had lost her mind. She waited for apology, explanation, remorse, anything human. He did not come that night. He did not come the next morning. He did not text. He did not call. Nearly 48 hours later, the apartment door opened and Adrian stepped inside, carrying a garment bag and a weekender. Marielle stood up so quickly the hem of her dress caught beneath her heel. Adrian did not look ashamed. He looked inconvenienced. He told her Sienna was pregnant. For months. He said it flatly, like a detail in a legal report. He told her Sienna had been his life for well over a year. He told her his mother had decided the family needed to correct the course before the marriage became legally binding. He admitted, in the same cold tone, that the wedding humiliation had been planned. The minister had known enough not to intervene. The front row seating had been arranged. The veil was not spontaneous. It was choreography. Adrian explained all of this with a detachment so chilling that Marielle felt herself leaving her own body just to endure hearing him. Finally, he added that the lease was under his name and she should find somewhere else to stay before the end of the month. She asked only one question. "Did you ever love me?" Adrian shifted the strap of the bag on his shoulder and said, "I loved the peace of being with you." "That isn't the same thing." Then he left again, and this time she knew he would not come back. In the days that followed, truth arrived in fragments, each one more humiliating than the last. A co-worker's cousin had seen Adrian and Sienna together months earlier. A bridesmaid admitted she had heard whispers but didn't want to ruin the wedding. One of Adrian's own relatives, after too much champagne and a fit of conscience, revealed that Evangeline had always described Marielle as temporary. A suitable woman for photographs, foundation events, and church appearances. Quiet, polite, family-less, easy to control. Sienna, by contrast, was messy but familiar. She had history with Adrian, chemistry, and now a child. When the pregnancy could no longer be hidden, Evangeline changed the plan. Marielle, the stand-in, became disposable. The church spectacle wasn't a breakdown. It was a message. Public, theatrical, irreversible. Marielle packed one suitcase and moved into a roadside inn just beyond the city limits. The kind of place where the vending machine hummed all night and the shower knobs turned with a metallic groan. She hung her wedding dress in the closet because she could not bear to fold it. The blood mark on the skirt had darkened into a tiny stain. Every time she caught sight of it, her throat tightened. She stopped cooking. She stopped answering messages. She missed work until her manager's concern turned formal. She spent hours sitting on the edge of the bed staring at the opposite wall, not crying because even grief seemed too active for what she felt. Emptiness had a weight all its own. What haunted her most was not simply betrayal, but arithmetic. If Adrian had been with Sienna for over a year, then every memory of their engagement carried shadow. Every promise had a second audience. Every affectionate gesture had been contaminated at the source. One night, unable to sleep, Marielle sat up in the dark and thought about Miss Eliza. Not in some grand, cinematic way, just a small memory. The way she used to fold dish towels into perfect rectangles. The way she would hum without realizing it. The way she once said the ring would answer questions when the time came. Marielle reached for the storage box she had carried from apartment to apartment for years. Inside, beneath old documents and a winter scarf, lay the unopened envelope from Harrow, Pike and Wren. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. The letter inside was dated more than a decade earlier. It was formal, concise, and addressed to her full name. It stated that she was the sole living heir of one Gideon Vale Hart, and that the firm had been instructed to contact her regarding the administration of protected family assets held in trust pending identity confirmation and personal appearance. Marielle read the name twice, then 3 times. Gideon Vale Hart. She did not know it. Then her eyes dropped to the gold ring lying on the bedspread beside her.
Loneliness
is quiet. The crest engraved inside the band
in a city
matched the
it stands shoulder to shoulder.
She drove to Charleston
of people
3 days
and still
later.
leaves you untouched.
The offices of Harrow,
Marielle
Pike
built a
and
life
Wren
from routine.
occupied the
She
upper
paid her
floors
bills.
of the sandstone
She kept her
building overlooking the harbor, quiet and stately in a way that suggested old wealth didn't need to raise its voice. A receptionist led her into a paneled office lined with shelves and city maps framed in dark wood. Behind the desk sat a man in his 70s with silver hair, clear eyes, and the posture of someone who had spent his life carrying other people's secrets without ever bending under the load. His name was Elias Wren. When Marielle entered, he stood immediately. He looked at her long enough for emotion to soften his face and said, almost to himself, "You have your father's eyes." It was the first time in her life anyone had said the word father and meant a real person, not an absence. Elias told her that Gideon Vale Hart had been one of the most private industrial magnates in the country, not the kind who filled magazine covers or boasted on television. He moved differently. He built quietly through shipping, ports, logistics corridors, technology infrastructure, land banking, and long-hold commercial acquisitions spread across the South, the Gulf, and beyond. He bought what others overlooked and held it until cities grew around it. He controlled networks, terminals, distribution chains, industrial real estate, digital infrastructure, freight contracts, and private equity positions so layered through holding companies that most people interacting with his empire had never heard his name. He had been, in public, nearly invisible. In private numbers, he had been unimaginably wealthy. Not millionaire wealthy. Not billionaire wealthy. The value of the networked holdings, equity control, and inherited market dominance placed the Hart estate in a category so rare people preferred not to say it out loud. Trillion-level wealth, structured across entities, trusts, and intergenerational protections. Marielle listened in total stillness. Her mind rejected the scale at first. It seemed absurd, unreal, like hearing that the moon belonged to your family. Elias kept speaking. Gideon had met Marielle's mother while traveling through South Carolina on a legal and land matter. Their relationship had been quiet but serious. When he learned she was pregnant, he began restructuring everything. He wanted the child protected from opportunists, hostile relatives, and the vicious attention that followed concentrated wealth. Before Marielle was born, he placed the primary legacy chain into a dormant succession trust accessible only through identity confirmation when the child reached adulthood. Then Marielle's mother died in childbirth. Gideon, already a target of rivals and extended family challenges, feared public exposure would endanger the baby. He turned to Miss Eliza, a woman his own mother had trusted more than anyone else. He funded Marielle's private welfare through anonymous channels, left the ring, left the legal route, and withdrew her from the visible line of inheritance until she could stand on her own. Gideon died of a sudden cardiac event when Marielle was 7. Because of Miss Eliza's wishes and the strength of the original legal protections, Elias waited. Then Elias opened a second file and slid several photographs across the desk. Ports, towers, freight depots, glass office parks, downtown blocks, rural land parcels marked for development, historic properties under restoration, data centers, hotels. These, he said, are only a fraction. Marielle stared at the images, unable to reconcile them with the cramped motel room she had slept in 2 nights earlier. Elias explained that her inheritance wasn't a vault of money sitting idly somewhere. It was living control. It meant authority over land, boards, lease structures, investment strategies, foundations, and holdings across states and sectors. Then he said the sentence that altered the temperature in the room. The Sloan family has been operating on heart control property for 14 years. Marielle looked up slowly. Elias continued. The flagship Sloan dealership campus stood on a parcel owned through one of the Heart Urban asset entities. 2 secondary commercial properties leased by Sloan Automotive were also tied to Heart-controlled subsidiaries. The church where Evangeline had humiliated her sat on land under a long-term religious use lease held by a Heart regional property arm. Even the luxury event hall, where the Sloans were planning an engagement celebration for Adrian and Sienna, was part of a downtown development block under Heart beneficial control. Marielle did not smile. She did not ask for vengeance. She only touched the ring hanging from the chain beneath her blouse and whispered, "Do they know?" Elias shook his head. The ownership structure was private by design. Public records showed entities, not names. No one connected those holdings to Gideon's daughter because, until this moment, Gideon's daughter had not publicly existed. Marielle sat very still. Something in her expression changed. Not rage, not excitement, but clarity. The ground beneath her life shifted and settled into a shape that finally made sense. She had not become someone new in that office. She had discovered who she had always been. The Sloan's engagement gala was scheduled for 10 days later in a downtown ballroom overflowing with orchids, mirrored trays, champagne towers, and expensive self-congratulation. Evangeline spared nothing. The room glittered with crystal light. A string ensemble played near the rear windows. Gold-placed cards marked every table. Sienna wore a fitted ivory gown too close to bridal for coincidence. Adrian stood beside her in a navy tuxedo, one hand resting over hers for the benefit of cameras. Evangeline moved through the room, radiant with triumph, accepting compliments as though she had personally authored destiny. When she stepped onto the small stage to speak, the room quieted. She thanked God for correction. She spoke about how divine wisdom sometimes redirects families toward their true blessings. She placed her hand over Sienna's and called her the daughter Grace intended. The room applauded. Then the ballroom doors opened. Marielle entered alone in a black dress, so simple it seemed almost austere against the excess around her. No diamonds, no entourage, no dramatic styling, just a clean silhouette, her hair drawn back, her face bare except for calm. The gold ring hung on a chain at her throat. She did not stride in like a conqueror. She walked with quiet purpose, which was somehow far more unsettling. The ensemble faltered into silence. Conversations thinned and broke apart. Heads turned one by one until the entire room seemed to tilt toward her. Someone near the bar whispered, "That's her." Another voice, sharper with memory, said, "From the church." Adrian's expression changed first. Not anger, recognition, the kind that arrives a split second before dread. Evangeline's smile hardened. Sienna's eyes narrowed. Marielle stopped in the center of the room. She did not climb the stage. She did not ask for a microphone. She simply stood where everyone could see her. A moment later, Elias Wren entered behind her carrying a slim leather folio. He joined her at the nearest table and laid out several documents with surgical calm. Evangeline recovered enough to laugh lightly and say, loud enough for the room, "I'm sorry, dear, this is a private family event." Marielle turned toward her and answered in an even voice, "It is on private family property." The room went dead still. She let the words settle before continuing. "My name is Marielle Hart. I am the sole heir of Gideon Vale Hart." No one moved. Even the waitstaff froze. "The land beneath this hall, the church where you humiliated me, and 3 Sloan commercial sites, currently under lease, are controlled through Hart succession entities now under my authority." Elias opened the folio. Trust certifications, control affidavits, property maps, lease abstracts. Evangeline's hand tightened around her champagne stem so sharply Marielle thought it might shatter. Adrian's face lost color. Sienna looked not at Marielle, but at Adrian, calculating at the speed of self-preservation. Murmurs rippled through the room, then died as people leaned closer to hear the silence. Marielle did not gloat. That was what made it devastating. She didn't need to. Truth, when placed in the center of a room full of pretense, does its own work. All current agreements involving Sloan-controlled sites are under formal review, she said. Your counsel will be contacted. Then she inclined her head once, more courtesy than they deserved, turned, and walked back through the parted crowd. No raised voice, no scene, no revenge speech. Only fact, only standing, only leaving on her own terms. The unraveling began before the dessert service ended. Calls were made from the ballroom itself. Adrian's father left the room twice with his attorney. Evangeline sat rigid at the head table, one hand pressed against the tablecloth as if steadying herself against invisible motion. Sienna spent the rest of the night on her phone. Within days, Hart legal offices transmitted revised lease proposals at current market rates, corrected for years of unusually favorable terms that Gideon had once granted because he disliked squeezing regional tenants. The updated numbers were not punitive. They were simply real, and reality was enough to break the Sloans. The dealership group had expanded too aggressively, assuming legacy relationships would always cushion them. Without below-market occupancy, the margins collapsed. Adrian's father called emergency meetings. They sold vehicles below value to generate cash flow. They approached lenders. They blamed accountants. They blamed market conditions. Eventually, they blamed each other. Adrian blamed Evangeline for turning a manageable personal betrayal into a public spectacle that now carried business consequences. Evangeline blamed Adrian for his recklessness, his affair, his weakness, his failure to contain Marielle before she became a problem. The arguments echoed through their large house until staff began leaving rooms when voices rose. Sienna saw the collapse for what it was, diminishing returns. She had not attached herself to Adrian out of devotion. She had attached herself to momentum. Once that momentum reversed, so did she. She moved into Adrian's condo for a brief period, took pictures that suggested permanence, accepted gifts, posted carefully cropped glimpses of luxury. And then, once the legal pressures deepened and the engagement story lost its shine, she began withdrawing in increments. Missed dinners, unanswered calls, a weekend at her sister's that became a month. The pregnancy remained real. Her loyalty did not. One day, Adrian came home to find several drawers empty and a note on the kitchen island that read, "I need stability for the baby." He read it 3 times before understanding that the word stability did not include him. Evangeline's fall was more public because her power had always depended on witnesses. The church lease reached term and was not renewed. Hart Council delivered the notice with immaculate professionalism. There was no anger in the language, no reference to the wedding, no room for accusation. The property would revert to owner-directed redevelopment planning at the conclusion of the lease period. The congregation had to relocate to a rented auditorium on the other side of the city. Questions spread fast. Why the church lost its home? Why had the Sloane's name suddenly become awkward in rooms that once courted it? Why did longtime donors stop returning calls? Whispers rose in parking lots, Sunday school classrooms, and women's circles. People who had watched silently at the wedding now told the story differently, depending on who was listening. Some insisted they had always thought the treatment was cruel. Some claimed they had known nothing. But memory is merciless, and a public cruelty staged in church does not disappear just because the powerful regret the optics later. As for Adrian, the silence he had once weaponized became the room he lived in. He tried reaching Marielle through old numbers, mutual acquaintances, even the bakery where she once worked weekends. Nothing. He sent flowers to an office she had already left. He drove past the roadside inn and learned she had checked out weeks earlier. He wrote letters. He deleted them. He poured himself drinks at midnight and sat at his kitchen counter, hearing echoes of tiny domestic things he had once overlooked. Marielle humming while rinsing vegetables, tucking one foot beneath herself on the sofa, straightening crooked picture frames without thinking. Regret came to him slowly, and by the time he fully recognized it, it had nothing left to work on. He did not know whether he had ever truly loved her. He only knew that he had mistaken peace for passivity, gentleness for expendability, and silence for weakness. By the time he learned the difference, he was alone. Marielle did not spend her new life in spectacle. That surprised many of the advisors who expected either grand revenge or luxurious transformation. Instead, she moved first to Beaufort for a while, back to Miss Eliza's house, which she restored carefully rather than replacing. She reinforced the porch but kept its shape. She repaired the shutters, replanted the garden, refinished the kitchen table instead of buying a new one. She spent long mornings with Elias and the trust teams, learning the architecture of what had been left to her. She studied reports. She asked questions about labor, community impact, debt structures, land stewardship, scholarship vehicles, and philanthropic inefficiencies. People expected an heiress to arrive dazzled by private jets and headlines. What they found instead was a woman raised by scarcity who wanted to know exactly what every decision would cost other people. She did not relocate to a penthouse. She did not sell her story. She did not grant interviews. She kept the Hart name largely out of public circulation and managed the empire through the same privacy structures her father had used, though with reforms. She expanded worker housing initiatives tied to port and logistics communities. She created a scholarship network for girls aging out of foster care or growing up without stable family support. She funded grief counseling in rural hospitals for mothers and newborn care programs in under-resourced counties because she never forgot how her own life began. In Beaufort, she established a community learning center named after her mother. Not after Gideon, not after herself, after the woman whose face she had never seen, but whose loss had shaped everything. Months passed, then a year. The pain of the wedding no longer lived in the front room of her mind. It moved further back, behind doors she no longer opened except when necessary. Sometimes, late in the evening, she would sit on the porch with a glass of iced tea and the marsh wind moving through the reeds, and touch the ring at her throat. She no longer needed it to answer questions. She knew who she was now, not because of the money, not because of the holdings, but because the truth had rearranged the story she had been told about herself. She had spent most of her life believing she came from nowhere, belonged to no one, mattered only in proportion to how useful she was to others. That lie had almost destroyed her. The inheritance corrected more than her finances. It restored scale. It gave her history. It gave her the right proportions of her own life. One autumn afternoon, a letter arrived addressed in Adrian's handwriting. She recognized it immediately. It sat on the kitchen counter for nearly an hour while she watered herbs by the window. Then she picked it up, felt the thickness of several folded pages inside, and carried it to the bedroom Miss Eliza used to sleep in. She opened a nightstand drawer, placed the envelope inside without breaking the seal, and closed the drawer. Some apologies arrive too late to be medicine. Some explanations are just grief in formal wear. She did not need his words to know what he had done or what he had lost. There adores wisdom teaches you not to reopen. In time, the story people told about Marielle changed. At first, she was the humiliated bride, then the hidden heiress, then the woman who reclaimed everything. But none of those versions were complete. The truest version was quieter. She was a woman who had been misjudged by people who only understood visible power. They saw no famous family standing behind her, no loud defenders, no social pedigree, no spectacle, so they concluded she was safe to wound. They mistook grace for emptiness. They mistook solitude for insignificance. They looked at her and saw a placeholder. What they could not see was bloodline, discipline, inheritance, restraint, and the kind of inner architecture built by surviving grief without an audience. And that, in the end, was why Marielle's victory felt so final. She did not win because she humiliated them back harder. She won because she never had to become them. She didn't rip anything from anyone's head. She didn't stand in a ballroom shouting. She didn't leak secrets to tabloids or posture with revenge. She let the truth stand up in her place. She let contracts, ownership, and lawful authority speak with the force of inevitability. Then she went home. There's a kind of power that performs, and another kind that simply is. The first kind needs applause. The second kind changes the shape of rooms by entering them. If this story reminded you that your worth does not shrink just because someone failed to recognize it, then pass this on to someone who needs that reminder today. And if you love stories about betrayal, hidden truth, second chances, and quiet power, make sure you share this video, subscribe, and join us here on Second Life Decoded, where every story proves that the end of one life can be the beginning of another. The veil slipped before the vows were finished. Not because the wind caught it, not because a pin came loose, but because a woman in pearl gloves reached up with cold, deliberate hands and tore it straight from the bride's head. The lace snagged in her curls. The jeweled comb ripped free. 3 silver pins scraped across her scalp and dropped onto the marble aisle with tiny metallic clicks that somehow sounded louder than the organ. The bride flinched, but she didn't scream. She just stood there in stunned silence while the groom's mother turned, walked down the aisle as if she were correcting a decorating mistake, and placed that same veil softly over the head of another woman seated in the front row. The church went still. The pianist froze. The minister lowered his eyes for 1 second, then lifted them and said nothing. The groom didn't move. Not one guest rose. Not one person objected. And the woman they had stripped at the altar stood there bareheaded, shaking, humiliated in front of everyone, while the people who had just shattered her dignity looked relieved, as though some necessary correction had finally been made. The sanctuary was full that afternoon. More than 200 guests filled the polished oak pews. Ivory ribbons were tied at the ends with neat loops that had taken 3 bridesmaids 2 hours to finish that morning. The stained glass windows spilled amber and blue across the stone floor, painting the room in soft color like heaven itself had approved the day. White lilies framed the altar. Candles flickered low and steady. The church smelled like roses, wax, old wood, and expensive perfume. It was the kind of setting that made people whisper before they sat down, the kind of sacred beauty that convinces everyone in the room they're about to witness something blessed. For one brief stretch of time, it really did look like a dream. The bride stood in a fitted satin gown with hand-stitched sleeves and a cathedral train she had saved for almost a year to afford. She had done her own makeup at dawn under the yellow bathroom light because paying a stylist would have meant sacrificing part of the florist bill. She had braided and pinned her own hair with patient fingers. She looked radiant in the way only women who have built beauty from sacrifice can look. Across from her stood the groom, handsome in a dark tailored suit, jaw tight, expression unreadable. To everyone watching, he looked solemn. To the bride, he looked distant. Her name was Marielle Bennett. She was 29 years old, with a quiet face people often underestimated and eyes that never missed more than they revealed. She had grown up learning how to stand still when life got cruel. By the time she reached that altar, she had already survived enough loneliness to make most people brittle. But Marielle had never broken outward. She folded inward. She endured. That was what made what happened next so unbearable to watch. She wasn't the kind of woman who caused scenes. She wasn't loud, messy, or dramatic. She was careful with other people's feelings. She apologized when someone bumped into her. She brought extra napkins to office lunches. She saved wrapping paper. And yet there she stood, in front of family, church, cameras, and God, being handled like she had no dignity worth protecting. The groom's mother, Evangeline Sloan, had risen from the front pew with the practiced confidence of someone stepping into a role she had already rehearsed 100 times in private. She didn't rush. She smoothed the front of her silver blue dress. She adjusted the diamond brooch at her throat. Then she climbed the 2 shallow steps to the altar, looked Marielle over from head to toe with open contempt, and said in a voice quiet enough to cut deeper, "This never belonged to you." Then she yanked the veil free. Marielle's head jerked sideways. A thin scratch opened just above her temple. It was small, but bright against her skin. Evangeline didn't even glance at it. She turned and carried the veil down the aisle with both hands, as if she were transporting something sacred. She stopped beside a woman sitting in the second pew. The woman stood before being asked. She had glossy hair, a cream silk dress, and the poised little smile of someone who had been expecting exactly this moment. Her name was Sienna Vale. She dipped her head forward, and Evangeline draped the stolen veil over her like a queen bestowing rank. No one gasped. No one protested. There was only that terrible silence, the silence of people too invested in power to defend decency. The minister cleared his throat, adjusted the pages of his Bible, and continued speaking as though a woman had not just been publicly stripped of her place. The groom, Adrian Sloan, kept his hands at his sides. He did not step toward Marielle. He did not say his mother's name. He did not remove the veil from Sienna's head. He stood there like someone watching a train pass, detached from the wreckage even while standing in it. Marielle looked at him, then really looked at him, and whatever hope she had been holding cracked without a sound. The congregation watched with a discomfort so thin it might as well have been approval. A few of Adrian's cousins exchanged knowing glances. One older aunt folded her lips into the faintest smile. Marielle's chest rose and fell. Her fingers curled once, then released. She turned without ceremony, gathered the front of her gown, and walked down the aisle alone. She did not run. That was what people remembered later. She did not sob or plead or demand answers. She walked with her back straight, past the flowers she had paid for, past the guests who had eaten her rehearsal